Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The First Victory, the Second World War and the East Africa Campaign, by Andrew Stewart, narrated by Michael Page. Introduction. A Forgotten Campaign. On 27 November 1941, the mountain fortress of Gondar, the last remaining stronghold of Italy's once apparently great empire in eastern Africa, surrendered following a final attack by British and Commonwealth troops. This assault lasted less than a day, but it marked the culmination of a military campaign that had begun nearly 18 months before, and which had witnessed some remarkable acts of leadership, physical endurance, and individual bravery. The headlines the following morning in the major British newspapers instead focused on the fighting then going on farther north in the Western Desert, where Operation Crusader was attempting to break the long-running siege of the port of Tobruk. It took 2 days before the story was published, and whilst it featured on page 4 of the Times, the tabloid Daily Express and Daily Mirror gave it only small columns on their back pages. The final success won by British and Commonwealth forces in this long and often exhausting campaign received the briefest of mentions. There was, however, an interesting commentary offered by one of the newspaper editors who told his readers, "Gondar has gone, or shall we say Gondar has come. The last outpost of Musso's tottering, or rather tottered and tattered, empire is occupied by us after 2 Italian mutinies and 1 final surrender. That means the end of a 6-year Italian attempt to pick a quarrel with us in colonial territories where we tried to deal with gentlemen but found they were jackals. The jackals, Mussolini's backyard, has now been dug and turned over by the British Army." Whilst the first part of the statement was correct, this indeed marked the fall of the Italian East African Empire, the rest was far from the case, particularly in terms of the pre-war Anglo-Italian relationship, which had not always been the subject of such animosity. This fairly crude wartime propaganda also, surprisingly, entirely overlooked the prominent role that had been played by British and Commonwealth forces in winning the battle. Indeed, it had been a campaign that depended on contributions of manpower and equipment offered up from around the British Empire. Nonetheless, it was at least a reference to a campaign that had, for all intents and purposes, been forgotten for some months. Following the liberation of the Ethiopian capital of Addis Ababa in April 1941, attention had swiftly turned to the defeats that followed in North Africa, Greece, and Crete, not to mention the drama that rapidly developed on the Russian steppe as the newest members of the alliance fighting the Axis powers seemed poised for a catastrophic collapse. In this context, an assault on a remote mountain fortress was no longer much of a priority for the newspapers in Fleet Street or the people who read them. Whilst it was one of the Second World War's most overlooked campaigns at the time, and has largely remained so ever since, the fighting that began in early July 1940 in eastern Africa should have featured much more prominently in the crowded literature of the conflict. On one side was an Italian army which included nearly 300,000 European and African troops. On the other, a British-led force just 1/4 its size and made up predominantly of men from across Britain's imperial territories, supported by small French and Belgian contingents. After an initial series of Italian advances, the much smaller of the two forces began a well-organized response the following January. It reached its conclusion just 11 months later in the mountains at Gondar. To get there, the victorious coalition carried out one of the entire war's most successful mechanized pursuits, launched assaults on what looked to be impenetrable mountain strongholds, and even carried out an audacious amphibious landing. Brilliant logistical planning was required to overcome an often inhospitable and unforgiving terrain, which encompassed a huge area extending from the flat, featureless and almost waterless bush of the northern frontier district, where Kenya bordered Italian Somaliland, to the rolling bush and hill country of Ethiopia. Added to this were the extremes of weather, from tremendous dry heat through to the humidity of the coastal areas and the cold of the mountains, as well as the threat of the arrival of monsoon rains, all of which meant it was not an area of operations suited to a lengthy military adventure. It was a campaign fought on several fronts, and to the north in the Sudan, whilst the weather was also extreme and the terrain at times bordering on impassable, the distances were much shorter and the attacking troops much better equipped. Despite its tone, the Daily Express was not wrong to highlight the abject nature of the Italian defeat, as 50,000 prisoners were captured and 360,000 square miles occupied, all at a cost of 500 casualties amongst the British and Commonwealth forces and just 150 men killed. During the course of the fighting, there were numerous military curiosities for the British Army and its imperial counterparts, including the last significant cavalry charge made by an opponent, the final sounding of a bugle call to direct the movement of a large body of troops, the first significant mutiny of British infantry troops during the war, and the earliest awards of the Victoria Cross during the Africa campaign. There was also the first loss of territory suffered by the British Empire with the surrender of British Somaliland, but the campaign also saw the first liberation of occupied land when the small protectorate on the Horn of Africa was later recovered. All of this has been almost entirely overlooked, despite, in many respects, providing a perfect episode of the Second World War to study, with its incredible military engagements and fascinating personalities and human stories which bring alive the nature and character of war. There are references to the East Africa campaign in the subsequent official histories and longer sections in the individual unit accounts, but the existing bibliography is not a large one. Although an extended narrative was produced by a British Army officer involving years of preparatory work after the Second World War had ended, no resulting dedicated history was ever written. The work that had been done was heavily edited and later included in the first volume of the more general account detailing the war fought in North Africa and the Mediterranean. An official Italian history was published in 1952, with a second edition in 1971, despite there reportedly having been very few official documents left at war's end to provide a factual basis for the writing. A report written in 1970 by the Enemy Documents section of the Cabinet Office in London noted that most high-level documents were believed to have been buried somewhere in Ethiopia and never found. In 1951, some civil administration and police documents had even been observed being sold in the markets of Addis Ababa to be used as cigarette paper. Those that were discovered were transferred to Khartoum, from where they also subsequently disappeared. In addition to this official work, a small number of military officers and members of the press who were present have produced campaign studies or their recollections of what took place. These accounts effectively convey the often unplanned nature of the fighting and the vastness of the battle space, but they tend to provide largely narrative descriptions of the fighting they witnessed, with little or no analysis of how this fitted into the wider war. These include, most notably, the recollections of G.L. Steer and Ted Crosskill, both intelligence officers who wrote about the campaign, and the correspondents Kenneth Gandar Dower, also an explorer and aviator, and Karel Birkby, a South African who was embedded with his nation's troops. There have been very few noteworthy writers who have been prepared to recognize that this campaign actually had a major impact not just on events in Africa, but on the entire war's eventual outcome. More recent accounts include limited references at best, and even these are susceptible to error. One distinguished military historian has written about it as having been an oddity and nothing more than a footnote to the 19th century scramble for Africa. Suggesting that there was not really a great deal of activity has been fairly standard. Another account was a little more generous, but still pointed to the advance from Kenya as having been a military promenade with distance, terrain, and climate the chief enemies, and not worthy of detailed study. The more recent assessments, aside from being very brief, continue to offer barely any acknowledgement of a meaningless campaign. Those writers who do show an interest tend to focus on how, despite overwhelming odds, the overextended British forces, often ignoring the fact that it had been a British and Commonwealth effort, muddled through to what had actually been a foregone successful ending. There has even been a trend to claim that the decision to fight in East Africa proved detrimental, as it distracted Britain from the war being fought elsewhere, specifically in North Africa, where the opportunity was lost to destroy Italian military forces in Libya. This is a new account based around private papers and documents located in archives scattered around the world, which have been used to supplement the very limited writing that has been done previously. Titled First Victory and not First Defeat, it does not dwell extensively on the role played in this campaign by the Italian military and its leaders, other than to provide some background for the actions of the British and Commonwealth forces. In addition to the official Italian history, a small number of recent writers have studied the campaign from the other side, and these works provide an excellent reference point for those who are interested. It is to be hoped that this book might act as a catalyst for the retelling of the Italian story, extending beyond a narrow one of abject defeat and incompetency. It also does not provide lengthy tactical description of the fighting, other than for a few of the most important, or particularly noteworthy, key engagements that warrant some more detailed elucidation. Where there is reference to bullets and bombs, this is intended, as much as anything, to give some colour to what was an often unusual and fascinating campaign. The papers of two individuals have proved pivotal in telling the story in the detail it deserves. One who features actively in the course of events, and the other who was not present at the time. Major James Blewett was a young British Army officer who arrived in Kenya just prior to the start of the British and Commonwealth offensive, and who was fortunate to have an important eyewitness role despite his junior rank. The often uncensored letters he sent back to his family provide an invaluable and frank account of the campaign which has not previously been drawn upon. The greatest resource, however, is the huge archive of work produced by Lieutenant Colonel J.E.B. Barton, an Indian Army officer who was appointed to act as the official narrator. Despite suffering from an illness contracted during the war, and knowing that he had not been the first choice for the role, he diligently sought to interview all of the principals who had fought on the winning side, and gathered together as many official papers and accounts as he could find. The written documents he prepared were presented only to a small group of British military officers and civil servants who worked after war's end on recording the history of the Second World War, but his findings will now have a bigger audience. Having carried out such an exhaustive survey and identified and incorporated new sources that remove the previous gaps in the history, resolving the debate about terminology has presented a surprisingly complicated challenge. There was some issue amongst those who were involved at the time as to whether the country should be called Ethiopia or Abyssinia, and, in turn, whether it was the East African, Abyssinian, or even Ethiopian and Eritrean campaign. Abyssinia comes from the Arabic Habesh, meaning confusion, on account of the country's mixed races, and this seemed a fitting description when writing about the battles that had been fought there. Added to this was a post-war argument about the need to ensure that equal credit was given to all who had been involved, with the suggestion that Barton had failed to fully recognize the role played by some of the British and Commonwealth forces and their commanders. For this reason, and largely at the behest of one senior officer, it was most frequently subsequently referred to as the Abyssinian campaign. Sometimes the post-war accounts therefore referred to two campaigns, this one and the Eritrean campaign. This study has chosen East Africa to reflect a more contemporary feel and to acknowledge that virtually all of the fighting took place in what the United Nations today refers to as the Eastern African sub-region. It also chooses to use Ethiopia as the country name. What follows is not merely a story of military adventure and bravery, but also one of significant strategic purpose and decisive outcomes. Senior British military and political commanders faced a hard strategic dilemma about how best to manage the limited manpower and resources available to them, but the decisions they ultimately took led to the destruction of Italy's East African Empire. And without the victory at Gondar and the triumphs won before it, there might not actually have been a much more celebrated final battle nearly 12 months later at El Alamein. Looking at it from beginning to end, what emerges is the story of a brilliantly fought campaign which both allowed the British Empire to attain its first significant wartime victory and secured the southern flank for its forces that subsequently battled their way across North Africa. Chapter 1. Strategic miscalculation. On 5 August 1914, the British governor of the East African Protectorate, Sir Henry Belfield, received confirmation from the Colonial Office in London that King George V had signed an executive order and war had been declared late the previous evening. Despite having apparently previously agreed with his German counterpart, Heinrich Schnee, to remain neutral, a special publication was rushed out which carried the governor's proclamations confirming that war had broken out, martial law had been declared across the Protectorate, and the men of the King's African Rifles, KAR, and the local police were now under conditions of active service against Germany. Emergency measures began at once, and the approximately 3,000 military-age white male settlers, both there and in Uganda, were mobilized. The First World War, a conflict fought primarily between the European powers, had reached to the equator and dragged in Eastern Africa and the people who lived across the region. This was because, following an agreement reached between Britain and Germany, virtually all of what is today termed East Africa had, by the end of the 19th century, been divided into the two countries' spheres of influence. What was known as the Scramble for Africa had led to the partitioning of the continent between the European powers. At the Berlin Conference convened in 1884, not only had Britain and Germany agreed to recognize their respective colonial claims, but it had also been made clear to the other powers in attendance that they should make their own territorial interests known. These would then need to be backed by the establishment of an effective degree of authority in the areas concerned. The British eventually secured control of an area mostly to the south of the equator, extending from the Indian Ocean in the east to Lake Victoria in the west, still the world's second-largest freshwater lake. There was a long-standing interest. HMS Barracuda first visited Mombasa in December 1823 as part of a survey expedition, and a small presence was maintained there for 2 years. It was not until more than 60 years later, in 1888, that the level of influence really began to grow. This followed the establishment of the Imperial British East Africa Company, a year before a similar commercial venture farther south and controlled by Cecil Rhodes received its royal charter. However, with the company's finances failing, in 1895 a formal East African Protectorate was declared and control passed to London, repeating an earlier political process that had established the neighbouring Ugandan Protectorate. 7 years later, the frontiers between the two territories were redrawn for the final time, remaining largely untouched until their eventual independence. There were also 2 other protectorates established during the period. British Somaliland had been confirmed as such in 1884 and was administered by a commissioner, and 6 years later the same arrangement was agreed for the islands of Zanzibar and Pemba, about 15 miles off Africa's eastern coast. This was a vast imperial expansion. It was calculated that the 2 larger territories of East Africa and Uganda alone covered an area of about 400,000 square miles, roughly 3 times the area of the British Isles. With huge African expanses now flying the Union Jack, this was a potentially valuable addition to the empire, with considerable economic benefits. There was abundant agricultural land. Coffee, tea, and sisal were initially considered to be the most attractive crops, and it was also relatively simple to raise livestock. Before the First World War, there was, however, limited interest from potential settlers in Britain, and most of those who were attracted to the Protectorate actually came from South Africa. By 1903, there were only around 100 European settlers living in or near Nairobi, which was then just a rail depot and 4 years away from becoming the capital. By 1911, the white population had increased to 3,200 men, women, and children. By the start of the First World War, it was estimated that in East Africa and Uganda there were several million Africans, nearly 20,000 Asians, but fewer than 4,000 Europeans, with only a few hundred of them living west of Lake Victoria, and this led one influential contemporary writer to question why such comparative neglect had been shown by the British people to these new territories. As transport routes improved, and particularly with the additional development of railways which better linked both of the main protectorates to the major Indian Ocean port at Mombasa, In the decades that followed, their appeal to both settlers and successive governments in London grew, keen as they were to seize the commercial opportunities that existed. This expansion did not really lift off, however, until after the conclusion not of the first major European war to be fought in the region, but a second. As the British-administered territories had grown, the same was true of that controlled by Germany. Centred on Tanganyika and Rwanda-Urundi, and covering a vast area encompassing the Great Lakes region, it was also just a little less than 400,000 square miles in size, and bordered all the British parts of the colonial map aside from British Somaliland. The proximity of these two European empires meant that in August 1914, as war broke out between them, this part of Africa would become a battleground, albeit with highly dispersed conflicts spreading over vast distances and with much of the fighting being done by locally raised forces. Just 3 battalions of KAR troops were deployed across the British territories of Central and East Africa at the start of the war. The African troops were referred to as askaris and were formed into 21 companies, a total of just over 2,300 men, plus a few others who were attached to the respective headquarters. They were led by 62 officers who were seconded from regular British regiments for a limited term of service under the Colonial Office, along with a number of NCOs who similarly volunteered. One of those involved described these battalions as very efficient units. The officers were mostly adventurous spirits of a sporting turn of mind, who had got tired of regimental soldiering in peacetime and had turned to service in less civilized parts of the world than they had been used to. They were the very best stamp of British regimental officer. Only a single battalion was based locally. The 3rd Battalion, KAR, had spent most of the period before the war conducting operations against rebellious Somalis in the north, leaving just 2 companies in position to defend the frontier with German East Africa. There were also large numbers of locally raised but still British-led police who received some basic military training but were not considered to be at the same level as those who had volunteered for military service. With so few men available, areas of the frontier remained unguarded and not even patrolled. But at least initially the Germans were little better prepared. Despite this, the Committee of Imperial Defence in London, a key body for determining British foreign policy, decided on 5 August, the day after war was declared, that Imperial forces would go on the offensive in the region, and orders were given to Indian troops to sail for Mombasa. Following a series of initial attacks against its outposts near Lake Victoria, German colonial forces quickly advanced towards this critical port in what was the war's first invasion of any part of the British Empire. They were held up by a heroic defence fought at Ghazi, just 25 miles to the south of it, and by the year's end had been expelled from the Protectorate. This was followed by a serious reverse, however, as an attempted landing by some of the Indian troops at Tanga, the second port of German East Africa, led to a humiliating defeat. In large part this was down to the superb leadership of the German officer in charge of the defending Schutztruppe, the 45-year-old Lieutenant Colonel Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck. Although he had not arrived in Dar es Salaam until January 1914, he was already an extremely experienced officer who had fought previously in the Herero revolt in German Southwest Africa. The 4 years he subsequently spent in East Africa confirmed his reputation as a remarkable military commander. Referred to post-war as both the Lion of Africa and also the uncatchable lizard, he has since become widely respected by those studying more contemporary irregular warfare. Seen in London as the Cinderella of the sideshows, the campaign was barely reported by the British Empire's media during the war's first few years, as events elsewhere dominated the press. This changed in January 1916, when the first South African reinforcements arrived, and with the subsequent appointment of Lieutenant General Jan Smuts as Commander-in-Chief. He had fought against the British less than 20 years before during the Anglo-Dutch War, but now set about clearing the border region between British and German East Africa and removing any possible threat. Support came from troops from across the empire, but the majority of his forces were drawn from the continent. 250,000 South Africans served during the First World War, a figure which included 20% of the white male population, and Britain's colonies throughout Africa also sent thousands of men to fight. Whilst the German commander's own forces never exceeded 12,000 men, his opponents used more than 300,000 troops in their attempts to defeat him. Despite the now huge size of the forces ranged against him, Leto Forbeck nonetheless continued fighting until November 1918, when he finally received word of the armistice and surrendered. It was 2 weeks after the war's end in Europe, and having been promoted in the field to the rank of general, he had the unique wartime distinction of having been the only German commander to have successfully invaded British territory. He was never formally defeated. In the years that followed, the strategic significance of the East African region grew. One factor behind this was that, in addition to its own potential, the region dominated important maritime arterial routes which were essential for the continuing development of the British Empire. Although suppliers had to factor in the transit costs, the Suez Canal, the link between the Indian and Mediterranean Oceans, which Britain had seized control of in 1882, considerably shortened delivery times to and from European markets. Ships travelling from India, Australia and New Zealand carried vital commodities to Britain: wool, rubber, meat, grain, tin, everything that was needed to keep a commercial entity functioning. At the same time, whilst there remained a British commercial interest in the Kirkuk oil field in northern Iraq, which by 1931 had been connected by pipelines to the ports of Haifa in Palestine and Tripoli in Syria, the Anglo-Iranian oil field at the eastern end of the Persian Gulf was still the principal source of British-owned oil. There was only one quick route for this to reach home ports. By 1939, just under 1/10 of all goods arriving in Britain were transiting via the Horn of Africa region to reach Suez, and although there is some debate about just how significant a total this represented at this time, once war broke out and commercial ships had to run the risk of being attacked at sea, access to the shortest route possible would become of critical value. It was believed naval forces operating from Aden and aircraft from the Sudan could provide some protection, but it would likely need more military resources than these. Without this, there could be no guarantee of safeguarding access to the Red Sea and the Canal and to Egypt beyond. Some political and military figures in London even warned that the supply chain could potentially become unsustainable, threatening the security of the British Empire. There was, however, still little or no strategic interest in the position in East Africa. If by necessity India remained vital, the perceived importance of Egypt, the essential link in communications, was the other dominating factor in imperial strategic planning. In 1922, the protectorate, temporarily established 8 years earlier, had been formally abolished, but it took another 14 years for a formal treaty to be signed with the leadership in Cairo. In an era of declining overseas commitments, official policy more generally was described as using treaties and agreements to give up whatever was not vital to imperial interests and to entrench in those places that were deemed essential. The 1936 agreement removed certain reservations that had long existed about Egyptian sovereignty and signalled the end of a military occupation of the country, but with confirmation that security of the Suez Canal would require the continued presence of limited British forces. These were largely confined within a narrow zone surrounding the canal, and some troops also still remained initially in the capital, although they were to be withdrawn after 4 years. Permission was also given for the same number of troops to be stationed in Alexandria, and for double that length of time, with further agreements to train and equip the Egyptian army and air force and to carry out significant updating of communications and transport networks. This was where Britain intended to maintain its wartime hub. The significant reduction in military expenditure that dominated this period, as was most obviously witnessed by the implementation of the 10-year rule made permanent in 1928 by the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, Winston Churchill, and signifying a belief that there was no significant threat of a major war developing, meant that there was little more in the way of defence preparations that could be done. The scant consideration given to East Africa and its defences was of course symptomatic of a far greater problem. Throughout the interwar years, very little thought appears to have been given to this issue, not just outside the region, but also by the various colonial governments who should have taken the initiative, yet instead seemed reluctant to act. The political status of the British-administered territories across the region had changed in the years following the...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?